and welcome to this special episode of Mission Makers, brought to you from Davos, Switzerland, where I was lucky enough to be moderating a week of panels in the mountains at the Lan Space Summit, which took place during the World Economic Forum earlier this year. It was a huge project, and I spent close to a year curating the programme for the summit, which was a gathering to collaborate on the most pressing issues of our current and future generations, converging the frontiers of technology and humanity to showcase the cultural essence of life in an immersive, elevated experience. We had some incredible speakers at our summit, from Deepak Chopra to the first African woman to pilot a spacecraft, Dr.Sian Proctor, and many other visionaries and thought leaders. I'll be sharing a few highlights from our panel discussions over the next few weeks, so stay tuned and let's dive straight into today's episode. We're gathered here today to discuss not only just the future of space, but how space can actually impact the UN SDG goals. I'm really honored to be joined today by Dr. Sian Proctor, the first African American to pilot a spacecraft. Christina Korp, the Director for Space for a Better World and the former manager of Buzz Aldrin. Fatema Hamdani, CEO of Kraus Aerospace, and Rafal Modrzewski, CEO of ICEYE. So before we kick into today's session, I'd love to start off with a video that really can explain the future of space and how Dr. Sian's played a role in that as well. So Avi, if you could put on that video, please.
We need to step out of the way here.
Wow. So, Dr. Sian, maybe you could first tell us a little bit about the mission.
Yeah, so last year I was really fortunate to become part of the inspiration for first all-civilian mission to orbit, where we spent 3 days in space. That was back in September of last year. And it wasn't just about sending civilians to space. It was also this idea that when we solve for space, we solve for Earth. And it was the largest fundraising in St. Jude Children's Research Hospital's existence, $200 million raise, and we made it to $243 million as of now and still counting.
I mean, wow. I would love also for our other panelists to introduce themselves as well and tell us a little bit about what they're working on and how they got involved in this industry. So, Christina.
Sure. Hi, I'm Christina Korp. I am known as the Astronaut Wrangler. I was in the entertainment industry and ran a small media company, and then I needed a break, so I took a job working for Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin. I thought I was going to have a nice, quiet, boring life and do it for a couple of years, and that was 14 and a half years ago. So I was responsible for Buzz Aldrin's legacy for at least a dozen years and ran his education foundation. I left at the end of 2019. I thought I was done with space after producing the last 5 galas at Apollo 11 at Kennedy Space Center. And then during the pandemic, I thought, well, maybe I'm going to go do something else. And then my friend in the White House, Chirag Parikh, who's the executive secretary of the National Space Council, said, "You're in deep space already. You're not coming back to Earth. You need to own your role in space, and you need to remind people who you are when this pandemic ends." And so I started working with other astronauts. I now represent 4. I have 3 more astronauts who've asked me to take them on. Sian is one of my astronauts. I wrangle. I work with Charlie Duke, 10th man to walk on the moon. Nicole Stott, who's an amazing human and earthling, and Susan Kilrain, the second woman to pilot this space shuttle. And I'm going to take on a few more. But I'm here because of Space for a Better World. When I spoke on some panels here 2 years ago in Davos, I realized how little people, all these people with all this money, understood that space is, I think, the most powerful tool to solve the world's greatest problems and the SDGs. And I am hoping to be that connector. My new tagline is, I'm trying to connect the space curious with the space serious and try to bring these worlds together and get people to understand that space is, I think, the key to solving the SDGs.
Thank you, Christina. I don't know how to go after these two. Fatema Hamdani, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kraus Aerospace. When we started looking at fixed-wing unmanned aerial platforms, so we're talking about persistent assets that can fly perpetually eventually across all different tiers within the Earth's atmosphere. So everything below low Earth orbit but it is a full scenario, right? So sea, land, air, and space will all have to work together. And so when I look at space, of course, the geospatial assets kind of play a huge role, but everything underneath across the different aerial tiers are equally important, from data collection, from telecommunication, and just bringing our worlds together, and how we then support the sustainable development goals, or as ESG focused folks are calling it. And so just bringing all of the data and connecting the world is the mission that my company is on, and that's why the alignment to what we're going to be talking about today. Off to Rafal.
Yes, thank you. So I really like the space curious and space serious. I guess out of those two, we would be probably on the space serious side. So my name is Rafal Modrzewski. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called ICEYE. We build satellites, we design them, we actually have a satellite factory. I'm glad that we've seen SpaceX, because in probably about 5 hours we are launching 5 satellites into space. They will complement the constellation of 16 satellites which we already have in space. So it's really, it's really changing, and it's changing fast. And as Christina was pointing out, I don't think people actually know about this. So it's a very important topic that we should talk about, because there is a natural connection between what we know about our planet and how we utilize space-based technology in order to learn more about this. And I'm excited to be speaking with you guys about this more. Now, what's unique about our satellite, just to give you a context, is that they don't use your traditional camera. It's not an optical picture that you're going to get out of this. Satellites are generally divided into communication and Earth observation. In Earth observation, you're looking at what's happening on the ground. Now you can do it with a camera, and that's an optical spectrum, or you can use what we do, which is radar imaging technology. Now the exciting part about radar is that you can see through clouds, you can see through darkness, you can see through volcanic ash, you can see whenever you have to see, which is why our focus is so much about natural catastrophes, because that's when you have to be there fast, that's when you have to be able to reliably take an image. And let's be honest, natural catastrophes don't usually happen during a good weather condition. So we tend to be there, and we tend to pierce through clouds, and that's what we can provide.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So let's dive straight in. I'd love to hear from all of you how you think space can help solve the climate crisis and impact sustainability, and what those investment strategies look like.
Well, I'm a geoscientist by training. I've taught geology and sustainable cities, sustainable worlds for about over 20 years now. And going back to that idea of solving for space solves for Earth, when we think about space is all about efficiencies. It's efficiencies in food, water, energy, shelter, waste. When we're talking about SDGs, those are the categories, right? And so how do we take that technology that is pushing the envelope of efficiency and repurpose it in ways down here that make us better? And as we push to the moon and Mars and beyond, we just have to keep getting more efficient in all of these areas. And I think that that's one of the things that isn't taken into account a lot, is the transferability of space technology. NASA has spin-offs that they've published for over 30 years that shows how space technology is being used and spun off as technologies here and applicable on Earth. But when we take and we collectively use not just the traditional old space, which is the ones that were run by agencies like NASA and JAXA and ESA, because of how much it costs to get out of the Earth's gravity well. You needed kind of like these big kind of consortiums of nations to be able to do that. And that's why there wasn't a lot of equity in there. But now that commercial space is to the point where you're not only being able to independently launch payloads to space, but with the technology that has been driven mainly by space technology in the reduction of size and stuff, that you're taking stuff that satellites used to be so big, and now being able to create cube satellites and things that with better cameras and stuff that can image the Earth and provide real-time data about what's happening on our planet, and targeting that data and that information specifically to look at things like hazards, but also where sources of single point sources of climate gases that are being released by industry, things that you couldn't do before, and really being able to target where sources of emissions are happening and tracking how it's impacting our planet. So I think that that's when we can support industries, the commercial side of what's happening, that are making, that their sole purpose is to try to figure out how to tackle the SDGs. Then we're taking that whole idea of solving for space solves for Earth and using it the way that it should be.
Well, and I want to pipe in as like having been the fly on the wall of the Apollo astronauts' lives. So first of all, I wasn't born when the Apollo missions happened, but somehow, some way, I dropped into their world and I was accepted in their world. And what I have learned and what I think we've lost over the last 50 years, there's a great John F. Kennedy quote that I love, which is, "We celebrate the past to awaken the future." And I've done a lot of Apollo celebrations. What a lot of people don't realize, or maybe they've forgotten, or especially this new generation doesn't know, when Apollo 8 went to the moon and orbited the moon and we saw Earth rise, that moment was shocking for the world, to see our whole planet. That started Earth Day. The Environmental Protection Agency was started in the US from the Apollo missions. And so that started a movement that made a lot of people think, wow, we need to take better care of our planet. And so in the last 50 years, there's been this huge awareness gap, though, of people thinking space is this separate thing from our lives. And I posted recently on LinkedIn, we live on a planet in space. We all are in space. This is something that's relevant to all of us. And so the greatest thing, though, that we've gotten so many technologies that we use constantly, and people don't understand it's from space. You're using a cell phone. You're using satellites in orbit. You're using communications that evolved from space technology. And so I say this because a lot of the people who say we're climate people, we're environment people, they're usually standing on a stage and they're usually talking about, we've got to save this planet. We should not be spending money on space. Usually they're using images from satellites in orbit, looking back at the Earth. And so often I'll say, who do you think is providing the data? Who do you think is giving you the information you need to save our planet? It's the space people. But the problem is the space people aren't so great at this messaging. And that's why I'm trying to be one of the conduits for that, because I'm a plain-speaking South Dakota girl. I am not a scientist. I am not an engineer. But I can see very clearly the benefits that we have from space. And I feel it's my responsibility, having been the one to help carry on this legacy of Apollo. So I want to remind people that the world we live in today, the things we benefit, is from Apollo, from the Apollo missions. And the game changers of today, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, most of the ones who are invested in space, Richard Branson, because of the Apollo missions. So we kind of need to remind the world of that, and then hopefully use that inspiration to remind people. That's what I'm trying hard to do, is inspire people to want to be a part of it. And then hopefully guide them to people like you guys and what you're doing, to show them what you've developed is a tool to help them fix the problems that they care about on Earth.
And I'm a firm believer it's an exchange, right? What you're saying. For example, we're building high altitude pseudo-satellites. We talk about aerial assets and we talk about space assets. There's a whole stratosphere in between, which has very low air density. So flying things there is very hard. A very similar atmosphere exists in Mars. There is no atmosphere, right? And so if we're flying with very low airflow over the wings, the same fixed wing aircraft or unmanned aircraft can possibly be used for Mars exploration. And so there is a lot of exchange that happens. In the military and the DoD, we use terminology which is called tipping and queuing. So you get certain piece of information and then you queue up another asset to collect additional information. And so that's why when we're building persistent unmanned aerial platforms that can fly perpetually, we've already flown nonstop for 26 hours, the same asset can fly up to 340 hours. So think of satellites that don't need orbits. Now, when you combine that and augment with what Rafal is doing or any of the other geospatial assets are doing, and so when they're scanning the ocean with a radar and they find things of interest, we can then follow up and get eyes on the ground and actually identify RF frequency, and that's how we'll stop sex traffickers. When the refugee crisis is happening closer to Earth, being able to actually stop the sex traffickers is as equal as making sure that the refugees get back on land safely. In addition to this, there's 3.8 billion human beings that don't have connectivity and access. So when we talk about equality and parity, let's get them access to the same resources we have access to. When we're building Web3, when we're building these tools, they get to have access. These are the farmers that are working in third world countries. These are the refugees that an average refugee spends 17 and a half years in a refugee camp and does not have an identity. They're nobody. And that is what we get to solve for when we come together with these solutions and actually work in conjunction with each other to solve problems such as wireless services. And I'll end at one last thing. Starlink, for example, right now, the crisis in Ukraine, the first thing that were brought down were some of the GPS assets, were some of the satellite assets. And Starlink had to put terrestrial dishes to get connectivity. Our assets are one of the best cell towers in the sky. So suddenly you're augmenting terrestrial assets and you're putting that cell tower in aerial assets so that your last mile or link to the satellites is possible. Now you're all coming together. And so that's how we actually provide services and data and others to the rest of the world, right? So I'll hand it off to you now.
Yes, I will try to add a little bit to this. I heard that the engineers aren't really good at speaking, and I'm an engineer, so I'm a little bit stressed right
Not
now.
all.
But
we're all engineers.
that's fair. That's fair. Look, I guess now that we are speaking to you about the sort of your awareness of what's going on, there was a term used that I think it's obvious to many of us, but it may not be as clear. The new space versus old space. Indeed, it is important to realize that what we are talking about really hasn't existed about a decade ago. I think it was about 2010 when the first CubeSat concept really was created in the university in California, Cal Poly. And from that moment on, this whole new space generation really was constructed. That's what happened. And so I was one of those people. I was building CubeSats at the university, and that's how ICEYE started. And so what changed is really the size of the satellites, the way we build those satellites, and ultimately the cost, right? And the fact that the cost has changed made it possible for a private company like ICEYE to own and launch its own satellites. Not only its own satellites, we have currently more satellites than there have ever existed before us. Right? With the 5 satellites, there's going to be 21 SAR satellites. That's actually more than all SAR satellites launched so far. And that was only enabled because we've managed to drop the cost per single unit by an order of magnitude, maintaining the capabilities. And now, I think what I was picking up is a little bit of an emotion over here, and maybe because I share this emotion with Dr. There is perhaps a slight amount of frustration, which is why we're on this panel, because I wish I could show you pictures because they do convey more than 1,000 words. We do see those things. We do see climate change. We do see icebergs moving around. We do see vessels dropping oil in the sea. We see deforestation. We see forest fires. We see flooding. We see all of those things from space, and we actually see them in real time. And we particularly see them regardless of the weather condition, but the community altogether can observe them. So it is very important for us to have this dialogue and figure out how can we convey that message, whether we are engineers or not, and convince the society to start harnessing, because it has been said, you cannot really solve those problems without having the space part of it, right? Those pictures, that data, GPS capability, anything you use has a space component to it, so we cannot treat it as something else. We've got to treat it as part of the solution because it is part of the solution.
I just want to add before you move on. I mean, this is the kind of conversations we need more, though, because and you guys know this. You go to a space conference, and it's the choir preaching to the choir. And then you'd go to another space conference, and it's the choir preaching to the choir. So this is why I'm passionate. I'm not saying all engineers are bad speakers. My point, though, more is that getting more open communication outside of space to get more people who aren't going to those space conferences to understand the value of what you're talking about. Because I think if more people who have the power to make widespread change understood what you have, what you guys have as a tool,
Yep.
we could do more. That's kind of my mission, hopefully, to do more of that.
Absolutely, and this room is filled with many sustainable impact investors. So let's touch upon the fact that by 2040, space is predicted to be $1 trillion industry. And Christina, you've touched upon the mindset and the sort of obstacles. What other obstacles do you guys feel are blocking the potential frontiers of investment opportunities for space?
I'll take a little bit on that one. It's very interesting, impact investing. The purpose of my company is saving lives. It was a very tall order when we started the company. We're going to marry aerial intelligence with decision makers so that they can make decisions faster and lives can be saved, starting with war fighters, civilians, wildlife anti-poaching, search and rescue, disaster management, wildfire monitoring. What's interesting is if we work with the DoD and federal, we're not viewed as an impact or a climate tech company, whereas the data that we're collecting is so relevant. What Rafa was saying, we're working with payload providers that will allow us to monitor 1 in trillion air particle. So truly monitoring carbon, truly monitoring methane or greenhouse gases and layer and stack them up across different altitudes, that's when we can actually see what we're doing and what the impact of what we're doing. Right? And so now going and marrying that with investor opportunities, and we have to be part of those conversations. When a country is at war, when there is a disaster, the carbon footprint goes out of the window. And so that's why we have to bring these solutions together and talk joint, and have the impact investors invest in technologies that are also working elsewhere and dual use, so to speak.
Absolutely. Do any of you have anything more to add?
Yes, I mean, of course I can comment. So, look, I mean, we both have startups, so we are facing the challenge of financing this whole idea of building the space capability. And as much as we have made it cheaper, it doesn't mean that it's cheap. It still requires quite a lot of financing. And so, when people tell me that this is going to be $1 trillion industry in 2050, I'm like, great, but where is this money right now? It's actually quite, it's quite challenging to raise money for space because people don't think that it is ESG related. People don't think that it is related to climate change. They hear the $1 trillion in 2050. They don't think about it, what it is, how much of this investment do we have to make right now in order to actually be successful in 2050, right? And the truth is that, look, if we don't start today, we are not going to get there in 2050, right? So this is going to take several years to build. We started ICEYE back in 2012. It took us 10 years to develop everything that was necessary. Those things don't really happen from one day to another, right? So I think if there is a call for action, I think, we do have to link in our minds space with sustainable development goals. And if we do want to support the SDGs, then we have to start thinking of investing into space.
The thing I would like to add it to is that, what you are able to do as commercial companies, though, too, is more flexible than a lot of the government, like if it was government funded or if it was a government grant. So, I mean, it's a huge opportunity for investors to work with more agile companies who have the ability to move quickly. I mean, we're seeing, like with Ukraine, what happened, which was really interesting. For the first time ever, Maxar, one of the companies that does Earth observation, we're taking real-time photos of the Russian convoy. And in the past, only governments had access to those images, and Ukraine would have had to try to apply to get those photos. Maxar was literally putting on social media, hey, here's the convoy, like on Twitter, showing them in real time. And that's the power of the commercial companies, is the ability to do stuff much quicker now. So I think it's an exciting time actually for investors to get in with you guys. I think there's so many opportunities, and that's what I hope to do, is just draw attention to what you're doing and hopefully help you guys get the support that you need.
Definitely. And so, Dr. Sian, could you share perhaps one personal takeaway from your mission that inspired you to make this shift towards a sustainable society? And I know you've been a professor and really passionate about that, but how did it feel when you were up there, and what did you observe?
Yeah, going to space is awesome. I recommend it.
So anybody, who here wants to go to space? All right, I'm going to tell you 3 days isn't enough. Go for at least 5 or more. So make sure you negotiate that. But the biggest thing for me, being a geoscientist, I know, a lot about our planet, and I know about the overview effect, which is when astronauts go to space, they get transformed, and then they come back more environmentally focused. And so I was prepared in many ways. But what I wasn't prepared for was experiencing Earthlight. And what Earthlight is it's very similar to moonlight. Moonlight is the light that's reflected off the moon and been back to us so we can see it. But I want you to think about you're walking outside and it's nighttime and the full moon is rising. And think about how that makes you feel, being bathed in moonlight. Think about our history as humans with moon and being in moonlight. All of the myth and the lore and the poems and the songs and love all around moonlight. Well, Earthlight is 1,000 times more beautiful, more brilliant, more spectacular. And when we opened up our forward hatch that allowed us to go into this beautiful domed cupola, I got flooded with Earthlight, the light reflecting off of our planet onto me. And before going to space, I had been to sea multiple times as a NOAA teacher at sea and on the joint resolution for climate science and doing all of those kinds of things. But it was apparent to me while I was in space and getting all of this Earthlight hitting me about how we are united by one sky and one ocean. Mm-hmm. And so when I came back, I was like, that's going to be my focus. I'm going to focus on, what is happening with, our atmosphere up into the stars and beyond, and then what's happening with our oceans. But thinking about, this is from a sustainability model, our oceans and our atmosphere, they're driving everything. And we really need to understand what's happening in this complex system, and particularly our role as humans in that system. And the only way that we can do that really is through real-time data analysis in the sky and in satellite technology, so that we can be better stewards of Afro-Gaia. Afro-Gaia is what I call Mother Earth. We're all out of Africa, so Afro-Gaia. And I like to think as an artist and a poet that she's watching, and are we going to be good stewards of our planet? And so Earthlight helped me kind of get that new perspective of one sky and one ocean.
So how can we ensure that when activities in space do become more mainstream, that they remain accessible for everyone?
Wait, say that again?
How can we make sure that when space exploration becomes more mainstream, how do we promote and sort of make the accessibility to more and more people?
Well, one of the things I say is that we need to strive for a JEDI space, a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive space as we push, humanity to the moon, Mars, and beyond. And, that Star Trek generation, but with a Star Wars twist, right? A JEDI space. And the thing about it is that when we think about how we can be equitable, we have to hold accountable the people who are making the selection and the choices they're making when going to space. And we think that, we don't have any of the power. It's all in the hands of the billionaires and the space techs that are doing that. But in reality, collectively, if we put our voice together and we hold them accountable and track what they're doing and get them to pledge that they're going to create a JEDI space that's equitable for all of us. But when we're talking about a JEDI space, it's not just up in space. We're talking about here, the space that you control, your space to inspire. And how are you making it a JEDI space, just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive? And it needs to be a part of everybody's thinking and their mentality. And when you think about the SDGs and you're thinking about solving them, well, if we can get that platform of just creating a JEDI space as a foundation for everything we do as a human, think about what the world would look like.
Yeah, I was going to say, we just did a gala in London for the 50th anniversary of Apollo 16, but I was really trying to position it about what has transpired since. And so I had 11 astronauts on stage, and 6 of them were women. It's probably the first time we've had more female astronauts on stage than men, and that was very intentional. Diverse as well with Cyan, but we also had Naoki Yamazaki from Japan, and So Young-yi, the first and only Korean ever to go to space, who's a woman. So I mean, that's the other part of it, the representation thing, which of course we do have a bit up here right now with women, but you know, it's people making a conscious decision. I made a conscious decision to have more women than men on stage, and to bring a diverse group of women on stage. So, and people noticed, they were really excited about it. So, you know, it has to be in a public way, I think, where people have the power to do that.
And I think there's aspect of it's very glorified, but there's other aspects to it. For example, STEM, right? STEM programs and how we're actually bringing folks to work on the hard problems to solve for, whether that be payloads or sensors or miniaturization. Power and energy are key components. To be able to fly persistently nonstop, the key there is power and energy. That means a lot of the investments that are happening across the board, and how do we, in STEM program, promote equality across? What happens is, I was just watching a documentary that talked about the MIT PhD classes, and women get trickled out because of the inequalities that they face during the PhD program. So we're losing pipeline there. And that's across the board is where we have to go in and instill that love and promote equality so that we're creating solutions for an equal space, right?
Well, you know, when you say that, that's one of the things. A lot of companies talk about having a DEI program and stuff, but if you don't have that J, if you're not striving for a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, then you're sure you can recruit minority and women of color, but you're not going to keep them because they're entering into a workforce that is not just, or they're entering into a higher education system that's not just. And you have to have that JEDI, that just component, if you're going to keep them and develop them. They drop out. And we have the data that shows it. But yet we haven't been able to switch, you know, getting that just component has been really a struggle. I mean, when we have whistleblowers, when, you know, the Me Too, you know, even Black Lives Matters, people have, it makes them feel uncomfortable when we're trying to establish this just society. But it's such a key component and really is the basis for building the rest of the DEI on top of.
Well, and it's important to have male allies. Yeah. I mean, really.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, my mentors have all been men.
Yes, I felt perhaps that I shouldn't be commenting. I mean, minority over here.
No, but I mean,
but she's right.
We need male
Look,
allies.
I mean, I think it's a spot on, and it's interesting how you can take this discussion actually significantly further than just space. You know, one of the SDG goals is actually gender equality.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? And I really can't imagine how we are ever going to achieve it unless we are going to encourage more women being part of the STEM sciences.
Yeah.
It really does start with technology, so that they can work there, so that they can become the executives, so that they can become the board members, and that ultimately leads to gender equality. So, you know, we haven't really gotten to speak about too many very practical examples, but I do think that this is one of them.
Well, you look at the space, though, and even in tech startup, and the lack of funding by investors for women who are CEOs and women in minority-owned companies. And we definitely need more emphasis on that, supporting them, because it's such an important starting place to be able to know that you can get funding for your ideas and be successful.
And I think one of the things to touch upon when we are talking about some of that is biases that exist. And even within, what's interesting is, and I can't remember the name of the documentary that I just watched on Netflix, it's about education and STEM, and how even women have those biases that are ingrained. And there are exercises that you do that bring out those biases. So we really, really, all of us have to look within and then help all of our counterparts to kind of come together to evaluate those biases, and not to change the topic from space, even coming back in space and how we're actually bringing new technology in. Empathy is a key component to understand what we want to use space for and why. And empathetic ability is a very feminine trait. I'm not talking male, female, but truly accessing our empathy, even as male champions and females, we have to use our masculine when we go out and raise capital or we run companies. But empathy is such a key part that differentiates all of us. And that allows us to bring better solutions for space, better solutions for Earth.
Absolutely. The biggest mindset shift starts from education. It starts from the grassroots. And it's amazing the change that's happened in the last 10 years to spearhead those STEM initiatives, because as you touched upon, that resilience you need to have if you've made it all the way to that PhD level and then continue is of course astounding. So, and talking then about accessibility and perhaps Web3 and, taking away the power from a select few to really get this investment landscape equalized. What are your thoughts on how Web3 could affect that space quite literally?
So decentralization of data, democratizing data. One of the first things, and when I use decentralization here in the Davos and WEF context, everybody's been talking about NFTs and Web3, but there is an aspect of when Rafal's private company is accessing RF or synthetic aperture radar data, that for us to be able to access that as a commercial organization and not just DoD or federal, and then how do we make that data accessible? So if I'm working for De Beers, making sure that their mines don't collapse, can I take that data and then give it to the farmers that are right next to it? And they can't afford to buy that data. So that is what democratizing data will do. And space data is going to be very critical for that as well.
I totally agree. I literally 3 days ago, I was just speaking at OE Global, which is Open Education Global, which, and when we're talking about the distribution of knowledge and how we can take on SDG 4, which is education, right? And it goes again to being how do we make, how do we support companies that are trying to make a profit, that they might have, new cutting edge technology, but yet also promote open source information, particularly data, and how we do things on a global scale so that we can bring everybody along, but we can build upon open educational resources. And so I think that one of the key components when we're talking about solving for space equals solving for Earth is, making sure that data that is being acquired is open source. NASA is open source. And then, when you think about a federal government, you think about all of the spin-off technology and all the things that have happened because of NASA and what they've put into, space technology, and that people have been able to leverage for the last 50 years. But now we're going commercial, right? And so when we're talking to companies like SpaceX, and even me being able to get access to maybe like my telemetry data or some of the, the videos and stuff that were shot on orbit, then it starts to get into this space of, well, do they want it to be open or not? And I'm a big fan that we have to have that open educational resource component, which I think is also what you're striving for.
I mean, 100%. And you don't have to really go far back in the history to look for examples of something exactly like this happening. I believe all of us remember the world without Wikipedia, and that was this huge initiative to combine the knowledge of different people around the world and bring it together into one open source knowledge base. And that was all about democratization of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And it has transformed the way we learn and share and what we know about the world. I mean, I don't know whether there has been many other things that had such a huge impact. And now that's great. Now, what the difference is with the data is, of course, the Wikipedia tells you about the knowledge. The data tells you what the truth is. Mm-hmm. You can observe things. You can realize where they are. And I don't really know how we could ever have democracy going on around the world if we don't have democratized access to data. You do need to have them in order to hold your government accountable. Mm-hmm. You need to have them in order to understand what's happening in your neighborhood. And yes, we are a huge proponent of that, and I believe every space company should be.
Well, and to piggyback on what you were saying, just to get back to the Web3 component, a big part of that is Web3 technology, because when you start adding the blockchain to data, then you know the source. You know, when we're talking about Creative Commons and how we license things, and when we're talking about making things open for people, but yet having, you know, the of knowing where the data is coming from, and being able to go back to the source and think about credibility in the web space, thinking about how that data is being used. And that's when Web3 comes in. And I think it's not a big part of that is the DeFi, right? Being able to democratize the, you know, the money and how we can access and trade money. But another part of that is just ownership, and how ownership is tagged within the blockchain, and being able to be more open with it because you know that the original source is being tagged.
And I'll just add a little bit and take this back into the back-end systems. Training data. When we're writing AI and machine learning algorithms, you need training data, not just synthetic data to train your systems. I'll give examples. We've been involved in a wildlife anti-poaching project, which is rewilding of elephants. You don't have to spot a poacher to know that something is going on. If you've studied how the elephants migrate or move, if something spooks them, they behave odd. And if you can predict their behavior or predict that there is something happening because of their behavior, and you've trained your back-end systems to do that, when wildfires happen, the wind changes, and that is what causes the fire to change direction and casualty increases. So if we have recorded how the wind changes and what happens to fires because of that, you can do predictive analytics and know where the fires are going to progress. And so that's how you can actually be more proactive in taking care of the things that you want to. Migrations, water movement, I mean, there's just numerous use cases there.
Hyperspectral imaging, like for farmers. You know, there are so many tools that I think a lot of people don't realize. Right? I was actually boarding a plane from London back to Colorado, and this guy standing next to us was a farmer who used to work at, or in farming with Monsanto, but started his own company. And we asked him, do you know what hyperspectral imaging is? And it's a type of imaging from Earth that basically helps you see where water is polluted, or maybe there's an area you should not farm because you can tell that the soil is contaminated. And he had no idea. And so that's, you know, trying to get people who are farming or doing certain types of business understand the tools that are there and having access to it. That's the thing I think is a big challenge that needs still to be solved.
Definitely, it's astounding to hear how there isn't enough, you know, being done to get this investment in. We don't have time. The time is now, and so talking about time, we don't have also that much time for many questions, but would love to open up the floor for anybody who would like to ask our panelists some questions. So if AV could get some mics distributed.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so many interesting points. I think going to the very beginning when you were talking about how the private sector is really pushing forward the space industry. But we know, for instance, like a lot of the private sector is always going to be driven by commercial gains. And looking at, let's say, what's happened in the food industry with regards to, you know, all types of products, be it palm oil or others, but these can be exploited. Where do you see, let's say, the government stepping in with regards to regulation? Is this something that's already happening, or do you feel that they're still quite slow and stagnant?
I'll take a little bit of that, and then Rafal, I'll want you to. So when we talk about aerial assets, there is quite a lot of regulation, whether that be FAA, whether that be ICAO, whether that be the government regulating airspaces and how we're moving up. The stratosphere doesn't have, it has to be a combination and partnership, right? And when I said earlier, we're a triple bottom line company, the more and more companies are focusing on purpose along with people, planet, and profit, or prosperity, as the new word is coming up. You have to be for profit. That's how you'll attract talent. That's how you will be able to compete with the likes of Google or Facebook and create equality across even industries and startups that are trying to come and bring in innovative solutions. So where there is a place for nonprofit is an interesting idea, but if we really want to do cutting edge, and we have to have commercial participate in this and support it, and then promote the right kind of commercial organizations that have purpose, that align with what we globally want to do. And regulators will have to work with us because they can actually stunt the growth. So yeah, it is a joint effort, and I don't.
You know, it's when you say it like this, that the commercial industry is solely focused on profit, it made it always sound a little bit evil. I don't think anybody wakes up as a founder and says like, you know, the only thing I want to do is to just earn a lot of money, right? I actually think that's very few of us that do that.
Yeah.
Now, what drives the requirement of profit is ultimately your board, and your board is represented by your investors, right? So the question is, who comes together to finance those ventures, and who creates the goals and the foundations for the moral code that those ventures have, right? If your investors, and we are lucky to have those, are SDG focused, then their primary goal is not profit, right? I'm not saying that they don't look at profit whatsoever. Clearly, that cannot be the case. But it's not that that's the only thing, right? And it's really, really changing, and you can see there actually existed, you know, Milton Friedman published a manifesto a long time ago in the 70s, which said the only purpose of a company is to increase the shareholder value. And recently, there's been actually a new manifesto published, which is this is not true anymore. A purpose of the company is to increase the shareholder value while supporting the community in which the company exists, right? And it is something that we at ICEYE really truly believe in, and our investors do too, which is why my sort of ask for you guys that are interested in SDG, you invest in companies like this and set the target being the SDG targets, because that's how it will ultimately come together.
And a company like Unilever, I mean, that was a really an unbelievable example. They do work with palm oil, and then now they're working with sustainable palm oil. But they showed the return when you focus on the right things. They were ESG focused. They actually went to their biggest advertisers and said, we will not put money give you our advertisement dollars if you will work with companies that don't align with this larger goal of people, planet, and profit. And so there, you end up making more money. It's more profitable for everybody.
Yeah, I did a Harvard Business School sustainability course, and Unilever had made some decisions to do the right thing, and then it was profitable. Like, a lot of times people stop themselves from trying to do the right thing because they're worried they're not going to make enough money. But the fact is, people care about our planet. I spend more money. I am willing to go and buy products from a company that I know is committed to sustainability. And I think more and more, especially this generation, younger generation,
I was just going to say, youth right now, if we want to attract talent, it has to be aligned with purpose. We have to do it right, and that's where the best talent is also going to, because they don't care about how much they're earning anymore. It's about why are they, yes, what are they getting up every morning, and why are we all coming together and solving for? And that also creates tenacity. As a founder that is constantly either raising capital from the right kind of investment partners, you need a lot of tenacity every morning to be excited about what you do. And if you don't have that purpose, it's not going to be enough.
And I think space is one of the most exciting places to do it. You know, that's the thing. There's so many incredible things that are going on in space. And I've had some of the big aerospace companies come to me and say, we can't attract talent. And I'm like, they don't know what you're doing. So, we've got to make people more aware of these opportunities, of what the kind of things that you guys are doing. Because I think if they understand that they're part of a solution about the things they care about in the world, they're going to be much more invested, not just as a job, but at being a part of something bigger than themselves that's doing good for the world.
Exactly, and the money will always follow, and one of the key themes of this summit is the spiritual codes of success, and going much deeper than just the profit, and going much deeper into the fulfillment of that purpose, because once you hit one goal, it's, what's the next goal, and how do you feel fulfilled from that and keep having that ambition to keep going to the next mountain, and a lot of that comes from culture and the people that you surround yourselves with and the impact ultimately that you make. I believe you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is on the open access to data. So Europe has been putting satellite data openly available for years, and then they supported startup to access those data. Then they created agri-food organizations to get everything to farmers. And it's not made much progress, to be honest. I mean, I'm a very European supporter person, so I was partly involved in that. So what do you think is missing to get that, to get impact out of, it's not just the access to data, it's people to take up and make the next companies.
So the DoD and federal government uses this term quite often, commercial doesn't. actionable intelligence, right? So first there's raw data. You can create insights out of that raw data. And then if you're focused on how do you make all of that actionable, it's the intelligence. And you're separating out the signal from raw data, right? And so for that, as you said, solutions have to be built on top of it. That means and that's where all of us have to come together, from data solutions, reporting, analytics, but there has to be investment flowing in there too. So it's all hand in hand. I think you're absolutely right. Just having access to data is not going to solve for it. We have to make sure that people are focusing on building solutions on top of that data, understand how those solutions then will be taken back to commercial or any other use cases that will address, and then how do we get investments into those solutions as well, is all key that brings all of us together.
And I was going to say, a key component of that too is on the educational sphere is data literacy for kids, starting at a young age, and understanding the role data plays in their lives. I mean, that's a long-term investment. But things like climate literacy, data literacy, space literacy, these are things that are really important to have infused within the curriculum, so that because it's really hard to take somebody, particularly somebody who's seasoned, and say, yeah, all this data is coming down, and then they just don't even know where to begin, how to access it, how to use it, how to interpret it, and all of those kinds of things, and it's a roadblock. So you got to have, savvy new generations coming up, but you also have to support the infrastructure that allows you to be able to, analyze the data in a meaningful way without much effort. So the infrastructure to create the portal between the data, the raw data like you're talking about, but then being able to use it and analyze it in a clear way that's really turnkey for the average citizen. And that has to be built.
Yes, go for it.
I mean,
Can we get a mic to her, please?
I can add a little bit perhaps to this if that's all right. I maybe, because I do advise on this topic, the European Space Agency actually. So it's perhaps a little bit going too far to say that it didn't really provide a lot of value. If you look at the numbers, it generated quite a lot of industry, but I think everybody agrees that the expectations were set very high. We were sort of hoping that we launched the Sentinel satellites and the whole Europe is going to start being converted into space database sort of economy, and that hasn't happened, which I guess tells us one thing. Maybe it wasn't enough satellites, and then it will take a while, and we do have to start now. In order to speed this process up, when we sat down and started analyzing, we realized that there was a piece missing. So we had the satellites and the engineers that were building the satellites. Then we had people that were focused on analyzing the data and trying to come up with the solutions. But the hardest piece to get were actually the users that knew what they really want the data to solve for, right? And it's actually a little bit about the space conferences where, the space people come to the space people and talk about how space is cool. We really have to go out and speak to the industry. We have to go and speak to the agriculture industry and tell, like, look guys, walk us through your set of problems and let's sit down together in order to be able to come up with the solutions, driving the actionable intelligence that will be able to derive that. And inspiring that user community turned out to be significantly harder than we thought at first.
Okay. Sorry, I have a question for you guys. So we've learned already through history that new industries, they're going to have different new impact on the environment. Is the space industry already studying them? And if yes, which they will be?
Sorry.
I didn't catch the question.
Yeah, could you repeat that? Could you reword the question?
So every industry, every transportation already have we learn already through history that new industries, new ideas, they're going to have a really huge impact on the environment. Space industry is at the sunrise, basically commercial space industry is now rising. So are you already studying these issues, with the impact they're going to have on the environment? And if yes?
Yeah, I think, space is quite unusual in that respect because it's incredibly unregulated. It's very difficult to regulate because it's a little bit no one's land, if you will. But the space industry has sort of taken already a bunch of initiatives to sort of self-regulate. We are talking very actively during those space conferences about how to ensure that you take down the assets. I think, this is really an interesting situation because probably, as far as I'm aware, it's probably the only situation in which the industry really started to grow at the moment where the humanity was generally already very much aware of the problem of space trash and space debris, right? So we had to start tackling it almost from the get-go, and that's a good thing, which actually makes me hopeful that we are not going to sort of have that effect of, we were trying to solve problems, but we really caused them, and now we have to solve them again. I really hope that, we are going to, perhaps it will go a little bit slower at first, but it will be much more sustainable in the long term.
And then, sorry, from a manufacturing perspective, so what you're saying, a lot of times new industries coming in and manufacturing kind of creates so we're manufacturers, right? We manufacture aircraft. And from the beginning, if we are following green practices, we're looking at how we can reuse. So for example, we do a lot of our R&D in co-manufacturing spaces so that we're not purchasing our own CNC machines and are not actually creating that. In addition, as Rafal said, we're looking at payloads that can look upwards and map out every kind of trajectory that is possible based on things getting out of orbit. So as you said, space trash, and how can so we can go up almost 350 kilometers upwards and measure up to 300 centimeters, that much of of a particle, and then map out and create maps of how things will be moving in space and what might get created. So we're all thinking about it now so that we're not facing some of these issues.
Yeah, and a lot of companies, so the US government Space Force has just invested in a lot of companies that are either retrieving space junk, or there's a company called Starfish Space that is going to set up a space tug as part of the satellite constellations of like Starlink to try to actually have a space tug there to repair satellites that go bad or to retrieve them. To be able to pull some of that back to Earth and reuse some of those materials would be awesome. So we're not just burning them up, So I think in some ways, even though there's a lot of focus on the waste, I think that space is actually one of the leading industries of trying to find solutions to kind of counteract it. I mean, look at what Elon's done with reusable rockets. It's incredible. Rockets used to just be thrown away. I mean, it's crazy. He gave an example of like, could you imagine taking an airplane ride across the world and then just throwing the plane away? That's what used to happen with rockets. Now it's incredible how many times they can reuse those rockets. And that spurred on a movement for new rocket companies to try to do the same thing and try to find a more sustainable way to do it. With less. As a matter of fact, there's a Spin Launch, is a launch company that is like a catapult, where they are not using fuel at all. It literally is it's like a catapult and then whipping things into space you can't do it with humans, but to send satellites and hardware and stuff and not have to use fuel that, will pollute our environment. So there's a lot of exciting things going on in space. And I guess those of us in space are pretty aware of it. But, trying to hopefully get more people, especially here in Davos, and people who care about our planet, understanding those opportunities and using them as possible solutions, that's what we really hope to do.
And just flying in space with space junk is just bad. So, a lot of avoidance. It was funny, like the week before we were launching, we got the final numbers on, our orbit, and thinking about, what are our chances of being hit to the point where it could be a depress of the capsule with space junk. And you're just like, wait, what is that number? You're like, okay. But it is something that the industry's taking on because they have to.
Well, we're trying to fix it. I think Alice is.
So yeah, we have time for 2 more questions, and we have to close
Sorry,
off.
I guess mine wasn't really a question, it was just a positive reinforcement. So NOAA used to provide a whole set of data analytics from around the globe, so you could always tell which way the tides are going. And 20 years ago, I did my agricultural degree. I couldn't find a professor who would allow me to do my study, my dissertation on soil and the use of different, essentially choosing different varieties depending on water, soil type, etc., because they didn't understand. And so I guess as part of your question was, why isn't it being used? I hate to say it, it's because our generation don't understand.
Yeah.
It's from speaking to Christina 2 years ago that my passion of trying to understand more has been raised from being here. But if the teachers don't know where to find that detail, and I'm not into education, but I am into trying to get our own generation to share with the youngers, because otherwise why would they bring it into a curriculum? Why would they bring it into their business if it's just something else they're trying to learn whilst bringing up a family, running a business, having a busy life?
Well, that goes again to, how do we reform our educational system, and from, professional development to teachers, but also for students, but also from a global society standpoint, because learning happens in and outside of the classroom. It happens everywhere. And that's why when we're thinking about these companies and what we're doing with this data and how do you bring citizen science into this, right? Because citizen science, whether you're in school or you're out of school, everybody can be a part of that. And so thinking from, from a company startup, and when we're talking about beneficiaries back, putting in that model of not only just being a JEDI space, but also when we're talking about equity and access and democratization of information, how do we add a citizen science component to the data that we're generating, and how can we leverage the power of regular people who are just curious, like Christina says.
Inspiration.
The space curious, with the space serious is what you say.
Yeah.
But that's it, right? And so I encourage you, especially the investors, that when you're investing in these companies, that you also hold them accountable for the JEDI space and citizen science component to get that data literacy going.
But that's where I feel like we focus so much on education and information, and don't get me wrong, it's important. But the inspiration part has really gotten missed. And that's what I thought Apollo, they did such a good job of inspiring people to want to be a part of this thing of sending humans to the moon. And so that's what I feel like I deal in. People ask me, what's your PhD in? Because I work with all these scientists and all these engineers, and I'm like, my PhD is in getting stuff done and in hope and inspiration, using the awe and wonder of space exploration. That's my PhD.
So final question from Cameron. I can see you raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful panel. My question is to Rafal and Fatema. The question is to do with private satellite companies, private space companies that are emerging, including yours. Rafal, you mentioned how highly unregulated the sector is. And from an investor's perspective, this is one of the biggest concerns. So my question to you is, do you believe Starlink is abusing the situation at the moment? And what are your comments on the prospects for future private space companies when you have companies like Starlink potentially, well, my question is, do you believe Starlink is destroying chances for future satellite companies that have yet to get funded properly or emerge? Thank you.
Given that we are launching on SpaceX in 4 hours, I would like to answer this question then. Do I think they are stretching it? I guess maybe the question should be a little bit reframed. Have we very often, or when was the last time that we have seen a major innovation that's truly transformational, not to stretch the rules just a little bit, right? If I were to judge personally, and this is not sort of ICEYE's official view, but my as Rafal, I would say that in this particular case, the mean or the end is fine with the way what you were doing, right? I think the bringing, the amount of satellites, thousands of satellites that are being launched at cost level unheard of in order to bring internet everywhere, what has happened with them in Ukraine, am I willing to forgive them for, they clearly are making this a little bit more difficult for everybody else, but am I willing to forgive them? Yes. And, that still means that we should figure out how to solve this problem long term. We shouldn't forget about it. We shouldn't just say, all right, let's now all do it.
Yeah.
But it is fair.
If I can just follow up on the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think if you take a look at even traditional industry, Facebook, Google, everybody has pushed the limit. There are things good that comes out of that, and then we learn from that. And we say, hey, Now when we're thinking about Web3, when we're thinking about decentralization or democratizing data, we have to keep those things into account. When innovators will innovate, they themselves sometimes will push the limit.
Yes.
But that is what the key is to be able to create.
But the concern from private investors, and maybe even your shareholders, will be preventing future antitrust issues or monopolies from forming. Once Starlink puts that many objects into at that altitude, what will happen to the prospects for future other similarly phenomenal concepts or technologies? And do you believe it should be stopped now by the US government? Thank you.
So I will give you a very technical answer, which actually, funny enough, is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive. There is actually a lot of space in space, and there is plan right now for OneWeb, Kuiper, Starlink simultaneously, and it has been calculated that they can, if appropriately managed, coexist. They do have to take appropriate measures, and there is a little bit of investment that they have to make. They need to figure out how to share frequency, and yep. There is autonomous, what do we do too? Autonomous evading maneuvers. So, when you have another satellite, you're trying to avoid it. Those are things that, so, if I were to look for regulation is there is perhaps space to regulate a little bit how we interact with each other once in space, but what I can say is it is possible to maintain several systems like this and actually a bunch of other systems in different planes if done wisely. Of course, if done chaotically, then this is going to be a disaster.
And we're already thinking about it. So for example, we're building out swarming technology that allows for mission-specific swarming. So we learn a lot from nature. We do a lot of biomimicry. Even right now, when you're launching assets at different aerial and deconflicting with commercial traffic, deconflicting with when you're launching and going up to the higher altitudes, all of that have to be taken into account and calculated. And now we have technology and ability to do compute at that kind of rate that allows us to predict how these things have to operate. Deconfliction has always existed. Even AT&T has to deconflict from T-Mobile, right? Whether that be frequencies or, so the same thing has to be observed as we go upwards as well.
And I like the cooperation part of space. This is something that you may or may not have been aware, but OneWeb was gonna launch on a Russian rocket. And SpaceX and Starlink is their competitor. And instead, they brought those satellites back, and then SpaceX launched those satellites for OneWeb, their competitor. So I like that part of the way that space will cooperate, because ultimately we're all trying to, do something bigger than all of us. I think that's something that I like about the spirit of working in space.
There's one more question. I don't know if you want to take
I know. Okay, can you make it a quick question? Sorry.
I'm not sure it's the question that's long as the answer.
True. That is true.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Lucian Tarnowski from United Planet. Back in 2013, Dylan Taylor and I wrote something called the Declaration of Space Opportunity, which looked exactly at these issues. And we kind of combined the Declaration of Human Rights and UN Charter to create essentially a blueprint for how we think about space opportunity. I wonder what your reflections would be, kind of closing reflections on how you would apply the best we can think about space governance to a planetary civilization, and how we can essentially reverse engineer how we think from space onto an upgrade for planet Earth, or spaceship Earth.
Spaceship Earth. But I think what you're talking about, we're already doing that. And I haven't actually read Dylan's paper there, but I should, but one of those things is keeping in mind when we're creating things like this, they've got to be living documents that get updated and renewed based on how the industry's changing, because it's changing so rapidly. But we have had a legacy of making our world better as a result of space tech. We just don't see it. We don't acknowledge it. And this is what Christina was saying, is that it's all around us in this room, everywhere, but we just are blind to it. And if you think of taking away everything in this room, including the stuff on us that has been impacted through space technology, most of this room would disappear. And so that's the thing that I think we're missing in that conversation.
Thank you so much. You summed it up beautifully. And so really thank you to each and every one of you for sharing your insights with us. I encourage you all to connect with them later. I'm sure we could sit here and talk a lot for a long time. And I'm sure they would love to all talk to you and collaborate on, as we say, making this world a much better place. And really protecting the future generations to be able to not just survive, but actually thrive on this planet. So thank you everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed having these conversations. If you want to grab a copy of today's show notes, then head over to missionmakers.com/Davos, where you'll also find notes from all of our previous episodes. If you're interested in talking to me about future opportunities at Davos, producing podcasts, or coming down to some of my music and motorsports events, then you can reach out to me at Mission Makers or at dj.n1nja on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Thank you as ever for listening. Until next time, keep it laser focused.